All righty. For those of you that have logged in early, we're just going to run through some of the basics here and logistics for today's Washington Academy of General Dentistry Stay Home, Stay Healthy CE webinar series. We're very pleased to have Dr. Lane Ochi today that's going to do the presentation. Some things to keep in mind. The CE credits for this webinar will be issued within the next 2 to 4 weeks. Please do not send us an email or call asking where your CE credits are. They will be coming, as I say, 2 to 4 weeks from now. We're extremely backed up. As you're sitting here and we're waiting to get going and letting everybody log in, you'll notice that we have lots of great CE coming up over the next 2 weeks. I think we have about 10 presentations, lectures from some great speakers. These are all sponsored by University of Washington, Comet USA, the Washington Academy of General Dentistry, the Canadian Academy of Restorative Dentistry and Prosthodontics, the Seattle King County Dental Society, Snohomish County Dental Society, Pierce County Dental Society, and Patterson Dental. So thank you to all our co-sponsors. We really appreciate that. Also, these webinar series, these webinars are being done with no honorarium from our speakers. So we really appreciate the donation of their time and their expertise. You know, these are lectures these people are doing and getting paid a good wage to do that. So again, we appreciate them stepping up in these tough times. Every speaker's flyer that is clicking up here has a QR code on it. You can utilize that QR code to log in and get registered for upcoming webinars. So if that QR code doesn't work for you, please go to the WashingtonAGD.org website and you should be able to get registered there as well. Also, please follow us on Facebook, and that will be an easier way to get registered for these events. Well, we've got about a minute to go here. So we're just going to let these flyers go through. Again, for those of you that are just logging in, CE credit. There's no charge for the CE credit. These are free webinars sponsored by the Washington Academy of General Dentistry. This is part of our WAGD Stay Home, Stay Healthy CE series. CE credit could be up to 2 to 4 weeks before you receive it. Please do not call, email, text, whatever, asking for your CE credit before then. You're just not going to get it, and we're just overwhelmed with all those requests. So moving forward, I guess oh, yeah, Dr. Queechin's coming up too. That's going to be a good one. Hey, we've got webinars for dentists, staff members, hygienists, assistants. So please follow us along and you'll find some good webinars for the whole team. We've got a continuing series with Dr. Yassine that is going to be on Friday afternoons, where he'll be taking different implant topics and addressing those in detail. So I guess we're coming up on the hour here, or 2:30 and the start of our webinar. And so with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our speaker today. You have seen his bio on your registration package, so I'm just going to hit some of the high points. Dr. Ochi graduated in 1981 from the University of Southern California with honors. He's currently an associate clinical professor in the Department of Restorative Dentistry and was the co-director of collusion at the USC School of Dentistry. He is also an assistant director in the Advanced Restorative Institute Dental Education Center and serves as a specialist consultant to the graduate prosthodontic program at the Veterans Affairs Hospital in West Los Angeles. Dr. Ochi has lectured to national and international audiences on the subjects of aesthetic, restorative dentistry, and occlusion. Dr. Ochi maintains a full-time private practice in Beverly Hills with an emphasis on physiologic and aesthetic reconstructive dentistry. I'm just going to take a second to say Dr. Ochi is going to do one of my favorite lectures I've ever seen. For those of you that are Operative Academy members, you saw this lecture at the 2020 Academy of Operative Dentistry. And I think it's just a brilliant lecture that really hits the basics of fixed pros, and it is a must for any young dentist, young associate, and dental student to see. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, Dr. Ochi, and you are queued up.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation, Dr. Hess. It's quite an honor to be presenting in front of so many people. I'm so sad that it takes something like coronavirus to bring us all together, but let's have some fun this afternoon and see if we can learn something. Let's see, is my first slide live? Nope, we're not.
Val is going to be able to share your screen there. It looks like she's working on it. So
I love technology, which is kind of a tie into what we're talking about today. We're going to be talking about, you know, the digital world and how you really need to understand the analog world to get the best and the most predictable results. So with that, it's kind of like the little preview. There's going to be several little takeaways today, and I'll try to point them out as we go along. And it's just one of those things that, you know, we think we've learned a lot, but the problem is you don't really understand why things work until you see your failures. And, you know, there's a great saying is, you know, experience is the name I give my mistakes. And I can assure all of you that I have experienced every mistake possible when it comes to restorative dentistry. So, you know, we'll be touching on on all those little tips and procedures that I think will help you become a better restorative dentist. The biggest thing that I really want to point out, that there's a story within this story today, and that is to develop the critical thinking necessary to understand all the interactions that come into play when we make decisions, not only in treatment, but material selection, everything from restorative material to luting agent choices.
Okay,
so
Dr. Ochi, I'm sorry. Now, if you slide down and you hit your share screen, green arrow at the bottom there.
Okay.
And I think we'll be good to go. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right. I was running out of things to say anyways. All right, one more click.
Hey, there we go.
And let me get on are we good here? Let me get here. Hang on, everyone. All right, so let's just go one slide back. All right. Are we up and running? People can see?
There we go.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Good. All right. So basically today's topic, as I just alluded to, is in order to have success with modern materials, it's essential we have a good working understanding of legacy concepts. Obviously, my disclosure, I have no disclosures to make whatsoever. I do have one favor to ask all of you, and that is, if you're going to quote me, please date me, okay? I've been around for a while, all right? So I also have a special thanks of gratitude to Dr. Herb Schillenberg, who's graciously allowed me to use illustrations from his textbook to teach fundamentals of fixed prosthodontics. And I want to start with two of those images right now. Retention and resistance, okay? These are key features to success. We understand that retention is that feature of a tooth preparation that resists dislodgement of a crown along its path of placement. This is preparation height, the taper of the preparation, or the total occlusal convergence. versus resistance forms, which are those features of a preparation that enhance the stability of a restoration and resist displacement along an axis other than the path of placement. Now, what's really critical to understand and walk away with today is that tension and resistance are interrelated and inseparable qualities. So if you look at the illustration on the left, if you were to fabricate a restoration to that preparation, it would have multiple paths of insertion. It would be able to go on in different ways. However, if you add one resistance feature, like you see on the right, if you add a groove, now that path of insertion is limited to one direction. You've effectively increased the retention, but that's just part of the picture. So when we look at failures, we have to ask ourselves, is it material or is it design? And it turns out it's a little bit of both, and that's what we're going to be talking about. So current clinical wisdom is, whenever possible, to combine sound retentive design with resin cementation. And we know that resin cementation is fairly predictable, but it can't stand alone. And that's why the flat top preparation, we tried it, it didn't work. And it didn't work because we know when we bond, to a flat surface, we create an infinite C factor, which means the resin cement cracks cohesively and adhesively during polymerization shrinkage. The real issue is that these cracks will propagate much more easily once you stress the restoration to shear. So, have you ever called tech support and said, I've got a problem? They go, well, never heard of that, but you might try this. They've never heard of the problem, yet they have a solution. I want to share with you a lecture given by Ivaclar, and I want you to read the title, Removal of Cement from an Emax Restoration After Debonding. Now understand, this presentation wasn't given 5 years ago. It wasn't given 7 years ago. It was given last year at Lab Day 2019. So there's still a problem with debonding of restorations, of bonded restorations. So why is that? And again, it's because of a lack of understanding of legacy concepts. So let's start with basic legacy concepts. Jorgensen taught us, or told us, that the most retentive prep that still allows a path of insertion has a total occlusive convergence of 6 degrees. So this is what we were taught to strive for. Now, the problem is with a 6-degree taper is if you try to do it on the bench top, you might be able to pull it off. You might be able to do it on an upper anterior tooth, but good luck doing it on an upper second molar. It is very difficult to achieve. I want you to visualize how hard this is to achieve. If your watch reads 1201, and I'm not talking about an Apple Watch, I'm talking about an analog watch, the angle between the hands at 1201 is 5.5 degrees. This is pretty parallel. We know from Wiscott that there's a relationship between preparation height, a retention feature, and resistance to lateral loading. So if you have a situation where you see a crown, like on the left, with a relatively tall prep underneath it, if you try to push that crown off, it's going to be very difficult to displace. But if you have a situation like you see on the right, where you have the same height crown, but the preparation is much shorter, I think we can all see it's going to be pretty easy to displace that crown compared to the image on the left. And from Wiscott, it was determined that the ideal prep height, for retention and resistance was 4 millimeters. But this was using a water-based cement. This was using zinc oxyphosphate, but so it was. The perfect prep would be 4 millimeters tall. Now, most people don't know, Wiscott also looked at 2 other cements. He looked at glass ionomer and he looked at resin composite. So now if we look at that 4 millimeter tall prep that was ideal with zinc oxyphosphate, all right, and you look at how well resin composite does that mean that a 2 millimeter tall prep using resin composite will be more retentive, more resistance to lateral load than zinc oxyphosphate on a 4 millimeter tall prep? And we'll get into that, okay? We understand there's a direct relationship between preparation height and resistance to lateral loading. And the essential elements of retention are the 2 opposing surfaces of the same preparation, the buccal and lingual walls. So obviously external walls have a place, but we can also have the opposing surfaces can be the internal of a proximal box of an inlay. So we have the buccal and lingual walls of an inlay box form. And what this effectively does is creates a wedge. Now, ideally, I think it's most ideal to have our preparations incorporate both features, external walls as well as internal resistance features, and we're going to talk about that. If it helps you visualize how the internal feature works, just turn the image over and you can see it's just an upside down prep. Understand there are two types of stresses we have to be concerned with. There's compressive stress, and a compressive stress occurs when a body is placed under a load and that tries to compress or shorten it, versus a tensile stress, which causes a body to stretch or elongate. And this is always accompanied by tensile strain. What's critical to understand for all materials in dentistry, especially our luting agents, that they are strongest under compression and weakest under tension. And this is how single unit indirect restorations fail in dentistry. They do not fail by biting on them. This puts the cement under compression. So when we bite on restoration, the cement's under compression. Single unit restorations fail to buccal lingual off-axis loads. Right? So as the pressure, as the force goes side to side, eventually the cement can break down and the restoration comes off. Now, if you look at this image, you're going to say, well, of course that crown fell off. Look how short those axial walls are. I'm going to ask you to look at this a little bit differently. Let's look at how parallel those walls are. And now if the cement off axis push against that, you're putting the cement against that wall under compression. Now, what happens if we have more taper to the preparation like this and the walls look like that? Is the cement now going to be under more compression or is it going to be under more shear? It's going to be placed under shear. So when we look at the physical properties of our cement, resin is superior than zinc oxyphosphate. Its compressive strength is almost double. It's 200 megapascals. But the Achilles tendon, the weak link in the chain, is really the tensile or shear strength. And again, resins are superior to zinc oxyphosphate. It's 10 times stronger than zinc oxyphosphate. However, look at its shear strength versus its compressive strength, 37 megapascals versus 200 megapascals. And this is why restorations fail. Okay? Now, Campani found by reducing the TC in the cervical from 20 degrees to 8 degrees in the cervical 1.5 millimeters would significantly increase resistance form. So if you have a situation, say you see on the left, where you have a difficult access, lower second molar, you can see the buccal walls tipped in quite a bit, and that's going to put the cement under shear. Well, we can break out the pedo handpiece, shorten a burr, and re-prepare this tooth. And we can re-prepare it by doing a couple things. We can upright the first plane buccal wall. We can place a proximal box. And by doing this, now in those off-axis loads, you have two walls that'll put the cement under compression. It's much stronger this way. Now, we talked a little bit about the occlusal veneer, the flat top prep. So if you look at that image and you think about what kind of force a luting agent, a cement's going to be under if you put an off-axis load on that restoration, and you can see it's easily under shear, and that's why it didn't work. So of course, Ivoclar revisited and redesigned the occlusal veneer, which really should be more appropriately called the occlusal onlay, and it has a buccal and lingual wall. And now we have walls that put our bonding agent under compression. But let's go back to legacy concepts a little further. Resistance features. What if we added an internal resistance feature like an isthmus or a pothole? Can you see now we have an extra wall that will put our cement under compression? If you want to look at purely mechanically, let's fabricate a restoration. With an off-axis load, it will have a rotational center someplace like this. And so to just displace this thing, the radius of displacement is going to look something like this against that opposing wall. But if we added an internal feature, a pothole, an isthmus, you shorten the rotational radius of displacement significantly. It's going to be much more difficult mechanically as well to remove this restoration. So going back to Wiscott, we talked about possibly is a 2 millimeter axial wall height sufficient to retain a bonded restoration? And I'm going to discuss Wake with you, and I want you to understand Wake is a thesis paper, but I picked Wake because I really liked his methods and methodology. And what he did is he took recently extracted wisdom teeth and he prepped them with different axial wall heights. 0 millimeter tall, 1 millimeter tall, 2 millimeter tall, 3 millimeter tall, and 4 millimeter tall axial wall heights. Fabricated Emax restorations, bonded them to the tooth, and then loaded them off axis until failure occurred. And this is a picture of his loading apparatus. It's an off axis load. And not surprisingly, the 0 millimeter tall axial wall height preps failed first. And it turned out the 2 millimeter axial wall heights had the greatest resistance to failure. Now, when I show you his actual results, I'm going to look at that and go, Lane, why are the 4 millimeter tall, why did they fail before the 2 millimeter tall if axial wall height is so important in retention and resistance? Well, it turned out the mechanism of failure is the teeth broke. So the additional destruction of the tooth for more prep height actually weakened the tooth. And that's something to keep in the back of your mind as we move forward. And it turns out the preponderance of evidence is in agreement with Wake that a properly bonded, properly designed 2 millimeter axial wall height restoration will be clinically successful. Let's talk a little bit more about internal retention and resistance. Okay, this is nothing new. The Richmond crown was discussed in the 1950s. And with CERAC, Endocrown was discussed in the 1990s. The problem with both of these techniques is that the Richmond crown typically was a post and crown and went down the root, following the root canal, and the Endocrown utilized the entire pulpal chamber all the way to the pulpal floor. And both of these restorations could transmit significant stress to the tooth, hence their failures. So I want to show you a lower second molar that an endo was done on. We did a NAR core. The first molar is going to be replaced with an implant. And take a look at the wall height of the pothole I created. It's about 2 millimeters tall. It does not go all the way to the pulpal floor. And if I put this restoration on the die, invert it like I write, I even tap the top of this and that restoration won't fall off. It's because the addition of an internal feature like this can increase retention by 4 to 5 times. So we could use this in our bonded adhesive restorations. Here's another endodontically treated tooth, the lower first molar, a composite NAR core is placed, and I want you to look at the wall height of that internal feature, that internal pothole. It's about 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters. It's the same height as my buccal and lingual axial walls. Didn't have to incorporate the entire pulpal chamber. And you can see the restoration bonded in place with the rubber dam removed. And of course, it's essential that we deliver all our bonded restorations with a rubber dam. And some of the wonderful takeaways that we can learn from is using something like the double clamp technique, which really allows wonderful isolation. But let's look at this preparation in a little more detail. It has an isthmus. Right? Obviously, it has a buccal and lingual wall, and those combined with the isthmus walls, again, allow 4 walls in each direction, or 2 walls in each direction, to be placed under compression in these off-axis loads. And we can see, because it's a monolithic restoration, that the amount of natural tooth that remains is quite significant, and the fit and finish can be quite good with these restorations. Now, I'm not going to talk to you about the physical properties of zirconia. What I want to talk to you about is the fabrication methods of it, because most of us aren't that familiar with it. Understand, and I want to be really clear about this, that the marginal fit of milled restorations is excellent. The problem is the internal fit of them, okay? With milled restorations, because it's done in the subtractive mode, the internal fit is completely dependent on the smallest diameter burr used to fabricate the restoration. Now, they make very, very small diameter burrs. However, they wear out very fast and need to be replaced a lot, So labs tend not to use them because it costs more, both the burr and time to replace. So they use larger diameter burrs. The problem is that this can lead to an internal fit that we affectionately refer to as something that fits like socks on a rooster. And while you may laugh at that term, I want to share with you a case. This is a single unit restoration that came in with a new patient, and she reported that it's been there for about a year. Now, one of the things we have to ask ourselves and we have to talk to our labs about is how much internal space are they creating? You know, labs don't want to redo things any more than we do. So some labs will try to ensure fit by overmilling the internal of the crown. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at this crown. It looks like it's got a pretty good length buccal and lingual wall. It's got a really big box form, yet it's sitting on the patient's hand. What I want you to look at is look at the thickness of the cement. Okay, I don't care what kind of cement it is, just look at how thick it is. You can measure this with calipers. It's that thick. So just because a crown seats easily doesn't mean it fits well, and fit is critical. Right? CEREC users understand subtractive milling, subtractive methodology. So this is from CEREC guides. And when the poor milling machine is faced with something like this, where there's a right angle, and we know the milling burr is a millimeter in diameter, the poor machine only has one of two choices. Okay? If it undermills, then that restoration won't fit. Its only option is to overmill, which means it takes away too much material in order for the restoration to seat. Now, I was visiting my lab, and he loves to share things with me. You know, I've got 1 foot, well, actually I got like mostly 2 feet in the analog world still, but I'm trying to learn digital. And he was showing me this case. He goes, look how cool it is. This guy's gonna have me make him a 3-unit FPD. And I go, uh-huh. And he goes, well, let me show you how I can design the connector. It'll be so strong. And he opens it up and starts showing the proposal. And I go, stop. And he goes, stop? Yeah. I go, what's that? He goes, what? What's what? I go, what's this? He goes, oh, well, that's the overmill that's going to happen for the restoration to fit on that little weird bird beak on the occlusal axial line angle. I said, wait a minute. You're telling me that with your best milling that you're going to remove all this information and all this material? He goes, yeah. And I go, well, isn't that kind of bothersome, considering that this is a material that hangs down? The thicker it is, the stronger it is. I got real quiet for a couple of moments. One of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, how did we end up with zirconia? All right, let's just take cost off the table for a moment. You know, it was sold to us because it was so much stronger than feldspathic porcelain. We were told it had a fracture strength of 1,000 megapascals versus 95 megapascals for feldspathic porcelain. Well, how did they come up with this? Well, first they used a 3-point load test. They took a sample of material of a known length and thickness. They supported it on 2 ends and down until it broke. Well, heck, I could even go Hulk on a piece of feldspathic porcelain with that test. So they designed other tests, better tests supposedly, and the next test is biaxial loading, where they take a disc of the material they want to test of a known thickness, a fixed thickness, support it in 3 points, put a punch in the center of it, and load it till you break it. And the problems with biaxial loading is you can change the numbers by surface treatment. So what they're reporting may or may not be completely true. Plus, if you think about it, you know, neither of these methods seem really clinically relevant to us as dentists. How about if we designed to test something that looks something like this? What if we took and made a restoration, bonded it to a tooth, and then loaded it occlusally until it broke? And this is what Sun did. He fabricated restorations, bonded them to PMMA resin teeth, took a 6 millimeter diameter ball bearing, put it on top of the restoration, and loaded it till failure. And this is what he found, right? What I want you to note is the drop off in strength from 1.5 millimeter zirconia to 1 millimeter zirconia. And trust me, 0.5 millimeter zirconia can be easily lost in most overmills. What's interesting that Sun found is when you look way to the left, the poor old metal ceramic crown, right? The stepchild of dentistry, 1.5 millimeter PFM. Now, if you subtract 0.5 millimeter for metal and opaque, and you're left with 1 millimeter thick feldspathic porcelain. 1 millimeter thick feldspathic porcelain properly supported and bonded to opaque is almost as strong in this test as 1 millimeter thick zirconia. So let's not take that treatment off the table. Now, a lot of us like to use lithium disilicate Emax. And so, you do your preparation, you fill out the lab slip, or your assistant fills out the lab slip, you check off Emax. Well, if your lab offers both pressed and milled, I can almost guarantee you're going to get a milled restoration because it's cheaper, faster, and easier. But that may not be the best because of the internal adaptation. Biari, looking at a number of cases, he sent to various labs, and he measured the marginal and internal fit of both CAD and pressed crowns. And I'm only going to look at the CAD results right now. And like I said earlier, the marginal fit of milled restorations is pretty good. So if we look at the lingual number here in this, it's 44 microns. We're going to talk about marginal fit just a bit. At 44 microns is clinically acceptable. But when he averaged out all the numbers, when he looked at the internal features, the axial walls, the occlusal axial line angles, the internal fit is significantly greater than the marginal fit. Now, I rarely draw lines in the sand, but I'm going to draw a line in the sand today. And that line is 50 microns. And you're going to say, okay, why'd you come up with 50 microns, Lane? Number of the literature points out what I'm sharing with you. I really like this example, this article by Mel. And if you read the title, you're going, influence of cement thickness on the retention of implant retained crowns. Well, what does it have to do with a real tooth? Well, I'll tell you why I picked this, because he machined ideal preparations out of titanium abutments. And what do I mean by an ideal preparation? The perfect preparation is considered 6-degree tape, 4.3 millimeters in diameter, and 4 millimeters tall. If you could prep the perfect prep, that was it. Then he fabricated restorations with internal fit spacings of 15, 50, 80, and 110 microns. She cemented these restorations onto his perfect preps, soaked them in water, and then pulled them apart. Again, this is not really clinically relevant test, but if you want to test shear strength of cement, this is a pretty good test. Just pull it apart. How strong is it under shear? And what he found is that the retention in all cases with all cements decreased significantly between a film thickness of 15 and 50 microns. And it fell off the table at 50 microns. So once the cement gets thicker, and reflect back on that zirconia crown that we were looking at in the patient's hand, once it gets thicker than 50 microns, the shear strength is no good. And this may explain studies and results like this. When Johnson looked at the retention of metal ceramic crowns utilizing the Rotary powder liquid hand mix and paste hand mix, he found that the newer paste Rotary product exhibited only 1/3 the casting retention of the powder liquid. Well, why is that? And I think the answer comes from Suleiman, where he looked at all the physical properties, film thickness and bond strength. And Suleiman noted something kind of interesting. Just because it's newer, easier, and faster doesn't mean it's necessarily better. Because again, everything we do is based on all the interactions that are happening. And so if we were just to pick our cements based on shear bond strength, and here's Suleiman's data looking at Rely X, the paste is on the bottom, the powder liquid hand mix in the middle, that the paste hand mix had the best shear bond strength. But it didn't do as well. And why didn't it do as well? Well, Johnson probably told us as well too. The film thickness, look at the film thickness of the paste hand mix. It's 110 microns. It's almost twice as thick as that 50 micron line in the sand I drew. Whereas the powder liquid hand mix in the center in the green is well under the 50 micron film thickness. So film thickness does matter. We all know the hierarchy of literature. RCTs, randomized controlled trials, are at the top. And we don't see a lot of RCTs because they're difficult to do and they're very expensive. So usually the best we can ask for are systemic reviews. I want to share with you a systemic review by Saylor looking at the complication and survival rates of single crowns. This is not a bad article. 67 papers made inclusion, looking at over 4,000 metal ceramic crowns and over 9,000 zirconia crowns. And they made a 5-year assessment, which means not all the studies, literatures went to 5 years. Some went to 3, so there had to be extrapolation of data. And interesting, when it came to retention, zirconia crowns showed significantly higher loss of retention. And so this is the data that he came up with, and I'll just make it real simple for you. Metal ceramic loss of retention at 5 years was less than 1%, whereas zirconia, the reports was close to 5%. And in your mind, you may say, well, 4% difference isn't really that great, but I'll ask you to take a look at the standard deviation, okay? 1.7 to 13.1%. That's a pretty big spread. Now, if you're a literature junkie like I am, and you love going down rabbit holes, you actually pull the articles that are meant for inclusion in the article you're citing. And in those articles, there's a real gem by Passia. Passia was a 5-year RCT, right? The highest level of evidence we can get. And what he found is he reported a 9.2 estimated survival rate at 5 years for metal ceramic and 74.8% survival for zirconia, and most of these were lost due to loss of retention. And that's a pretty significant difference. And that's something that we need to keep in the back of our minds. Well, just maybe, we talked about interactions. Well, maybe we've had a lot more time, and we have had a lot more time to learn how to work with impression materials, dye stones, waxing, investing, and casting. Well, Vajani did a really interesting study. He fabricated and cemented restorations on tooth preparations. And he did it both conventionally. He took impression, poured it up, waxed it, invested, and cast it. He also scanned the preparations, and he milled the wax patterns. Then those wax patterns were invested and casted and cemented. And this is what he found. On the left, in the red, you can see the margin cement and the actual wall cements of the CAD wax patterns. On the right, you can see margin cement and actual wall cement in the wax and cast. And it's clear from the images, and it's clear from his data, that conventional wax and cast fit better than the milled wax patterns. So I think it's pretty safe to say, well, you can't out-mill a poor preparation. You might be able to outcast it. And our clinical realities there are patients that are difficult to work on. There are teeth that are difficult to restore. And so if you have a preparation that lacks resistance and retention, you may want to consider using a wax and cast indirect restoration versus a bonded one. You're going to have better results. Let's step back and talk about margin fit. Where did we come up with the gold standard, if you'll pardon the pun? And it came from Christensen in the 1960s. And what Gordon did is he prepared MOD gold onlays on bicuspids, fabricated and then cemented gold castings. And then he's going to ask his evaluators to rate the margins as being either clinically acceptable or unacceptable. Now, Gordon, being a good operator, he finished the buccal margins, the occlusal margins. He finished the proximal margins, but he did not finish the gingival margins because he has no access to them, nor did he make the gingival margins visually accessible to his evaluators because that's how it would be clinically. And what his evaluators came up with is that an acceptable gingival margin fit was someplace between 34 and 119 microns. And this is our standard. Now, when you parse this out, it's really obvious that his evaluators would be much pickier when they could see the margin versus not see it. In fact, the standard deviation on occlusal margins was 2 to 51 microns, right? Somebody bounced a 2 micron margin. Now, aren't you glad you didn't have that guy as your clinical instructor on the floor, right? I like gold. I practice in Beverly Hills, ground zero for the aesthetic dentistry, and yet 50% of my operative dentistry is still gold. You can see the MOD gold onlay I fabricated on the second bicuspid, and I'm told gold's not aesthetic. But the red arrow, if you'll take a look at it, it's pointing to the margin of a DO onlay on that first buy. Now, I love the fit and finish of it, but I'm more in love, if you want to talk about aesthetics, look at the beauty of that whole buckle of that natural tooth. I mean, that's the best aesthetics in the world. Again, if you know me well, you know I hate giving abstracts. I want the entire article. And I just want you to remember that reading abstracts, just don't give us the whole story. In this article by Azir, looking at the marginal fit of lithium disilicate, milled versus pressed, said that the pressed crowns had significantly smaller margins than the CAD ones. Well, here's what he actually found, that the best CAD fit every bit as good as the best pressed. However, the worst CAD were a little worse than the worst press. And so it averaged out that when you look at the final numbers, the press crowns had marginal gaps of about 38 microns, and the CAD had a marginal gap of a little over 40. Same standard deviation. And when you add in that standard deviation, in both cases, you're well in the acceptable fit range that Christensen came up with. How you prepped actually depended on when you went to dental school. When I went to dental school, gold was king. Okay? And we were taught the long bevel. And why were we taught the long bevel? Well, we were taught the long bevel because of the mu angle, known as the rate of closure, that as a bevel closed, it would close faster than a horizontal portion of that crown, say the occlusal or the shoulder. There was one problem with the mu angle. It did not take into consideration the presence of a eluting agent, the presence of cement. So we now know that when you have cement present and you try to crown with a really long bevel, it won't seat fully. So if you look over on the right, you'll see a 5-degree bevel and a 15-degree bevel are actually being held up by the cement. If you like to use bevels, the best fitting bevels are 30 to 45 degrees or a 90-degree exit angle. We also know that there's no significant differences between the axial and marginal fit of tooth preparations utilizing a shoulder bevel, or chamfer finish line. So if you reflect back on what Wake found, that the additional destruction of a tooth actually would weaken it, and we know that shoulders and shoulder bevels are aggressive and very stressful to tooth preparations. With all ceramic restorations, we can take those preparations off the table, and we should. And we should focus on chamfer finish lines. And, I often say if I only had one diamond, it would be a chamfer. In fact, I only have 2 diamonds on my prep tray. I have a very, very narrow diamond for interproximal separation, and I have this diamond. It is a 1.4 millimeter diameter chamfer, and it looks like this up close. It has a 6-degree TOC, and depending how you utilize this, you can get different amounts of reduction and different margin exit lines. So if you're working on a posterior, you prep partially to the radius. You don't need as much reduction. You can get an exit finish line between 30 and 45 degrees. If you're prepping an anterior tooth, if you prep to the radius, you can have 0.7 millimeter reduction and a 90-degree exit angle. And 0.7 millimeters is more than enough room for an aesthetic all ceramic restoration. And this is what Schellenberg shows and tells us to do. More importantly, the chamfer finish line, impressed or scanned, it is the easiest margin to read. And this is really critical because if our preparations meet all the requirements of retention and resistance, but they don't fit the margin, then our mode of failure is marginal leakage. And that's why this restoration had to be removed. Well, it's essential for us to understand the interaction in our relationship with the laboratories, right? So when dentists are asked, why do we change laboratories? The number one reason is not cost. The number one reason is inconsistent quality, fit and finish. Cost was a far second. What happens if you ask laboratories to rate their problems with us? What are their issues with dentists? And again, number one isn't our complaining about wanting to do it cheaper. Their problem with us is our impression taking skills. Number one, impression taking skills. Well, maybe saying, oh, it doesn't matter. I do optical capture. So in a survey just last year, looking at technology in offices, 17% of the offices reported that they used optical capture. It's interesting when you parse that out a little bit more, they don't use it all the time. Okay. Now, understand even more importantly, this number is not that much greater than it was a decade ago. And so if you're into technology, this still puts us in the early adopter phase. And does it really make a difference? So when labs are surveyed on the impact of digital technology on remakes, 54% of labs reported that the technology isn't yet resulting in fewer remakes. In fact, 8% reported that it was resulting in more remakes. Stacy Simmons, writing an article for Dental Economics, went to a 15,000 strong dental Facebook page and asked them, what do we do that makes your life easy or impossible, excuse me? Their answers are pretty funny. They don't think we use retraction cord, our impressions. But their new favorite is digital cases. And you can read, what was written, that somebody marks it incorrectly and they're asked to remake it at no charge. Or when the digital case is sent and they can't see the margins, they aren't marked, and they expect the technician to figure it out. This isn't that uncommon. Again, visiting the lab. This is not my case, but somebody got a lovely scanner, beautiful colors. But let's take a look more closely. And what do we see? Look at this. This is tissue laying over the buccal margin, right? What is the technician supposed to do with this? You're going to have to guess the entire buccal margin. I put this impression up, not because it's an ideal impression, because everyone looking at it is going to say, that is awful. It is very clear that the light body never bonded to the heavy body tray material. Yet this kind of impression is sent to labs on a daily basis. Rao, looking at the quality of fixed prosthodontic impressions, they visited 3 large and 1 small commercial laboratory over a year period. They had the opportunity to evaluate over 1,000 impressions, and this is the scary number. 86% of the examined impressions had at least 1 detectable error, and a majority of these errors were critical errors pertaining to the finish line. This is what they found. Number 1, almost 50%, lack of gingival displacement. Number 2 and 3 were real close. Number 2 was a tray touch, and we'll talk about that in a moment, and right behind it was a detectable void on the finish line, a bubble, a problem, so they couldn't get a good read. This is kind of interesting to me. To me, the indirect restoration should be the most predictable and most profitable procedure in our offices. Yet we have trouble with it, so much so that manufacturers are making entire workflows to help us do this, the single unit indirect restoration. And trust me, when you buy specific workflows and materials, it gets very expensive and it's not so profitable anymore. Where does it start? It all starts with managing the tissue. And I want to talk about gingival displacement, not gingival retraction. Think of it as Maynard and Wilson talked about this in the 70s. We need to understand the physiologic dimensions of the periodontium as it applies to what we're doing restoratively. More recently revisited by Coyce. Understand the dimensions of the sulcus is very, very small. It's 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter. And if we're not careful with displacing the tissue, if we pack cord too aggressively rather than placing cord, it's quite easy to sever the junctional epithelium. And so I'm asking you to be very careful if you're working in the anterior aesthetic zone or thin tissue areas, when you place your primary cords, not to chase your margin after it. Don't keep going more gingivally, because if you're not careful, you're going to end up with a biologic width problem. Understand that, if you're going to use cord, probably the 2-cord technique is the best, but it's important to note that each cord has a specific job to do. The first cord is to create horizontal displacement of the tissue. And I try to teach hollow cord for first cord. I like hollow cord because it places very easily, it stays in place nicely, and because it's hollow, when you put pressure on it, you're not putting as much pressure on the attachment. The job of the secondary cord is to create horizontal displacement. This is what's creating the room for our impression materials. And this is where a solid cord works the best. So let's just do a case real quick where we captured impression. I'm just removing this old metal ceramic restoration. And this is what it looks like immediately after removal of the crown. You know, nothing's been done to the prep, and I'm placing a primary cord. And in this case, I'm using 3/0 surgical silk. And I like surgical silk because it's easy to place, it stays in place nicely. It also, because it's dark, okay, it's very easy to see it and visualize the dimensions of the sulcus. And if you have to prep and you have to chase decay, if your burr touches the cord, the silk, it will cut it, but it won't pull it out of the sulcus. And one of the most important reasons, it's dirt cheap. A 100-yard spool will cost you $30. So this is what the preparation looks like completed. The margin is staying above the primary cord. It's a 0.7 millimeter chamfer. And I want you to look at the mesial margin. We're now going to be placing our secondary solid cord. You can see the tissue is blanching. You can see at the mesial margin, the tissue is being pushed horizontally. This is the room for our impression material. We're going to remove the secondary cord and take our impression, evaluate the impression. We should see a good 360-degree capture, and you note the primary cord did its job because you can see flash of the impression material past the margin. Where we started, and in this case, I chose to use a metal ceramic restoration, not all ceramic. Is it perfect? No. Is it believable? Absolutely. But more importantly, take a look at the tissue. That's our goal. We can have other tools in our toolbox. White clay is one of them. It's sold under the brand name of Expancel. And this is a pretty interesting product because it has a very high concentration of aluminum chloride, 15%. And what the white clay is supposed to do, you inject it into the sulcus and it expands, and this causes tissue displacement. The problems with this product and products like it is they provide great hemostasis because of the high concentration of aluminum chloride, but the white clay doesn't really expand that much, so it provides very little gingival retraction. But as we talked about earlier, in say the thin tissue anterior case or the high osseous crest case, this might be a better choice to use rather than conventional retraction cord where you run the risk of getting recession and having a cosmetic failure. I understand it doesn't work very well in deep margin locations. Under the tissue, you had to follow an old restoration, secondary decay. And people do some interesting workarounds, right? They inject it, they pack it down, they have the patient bite on a CompuCap. Well, no, it's an awfully expensive product doing that. So why do it when it's not even indicated? Just use cord. I put this comment in just because sometimes our assistants don't help us. And one of the ways that they don't help us is that they start loading the impression tray or the double bite tray before you've removed your retraction cord. And if they start loading that tray, you remove the retraction cord and you don't have full hemostasis, so you get bleeding, you're not going to be able to stop it in time to take that impression. So go ahead and take the impression. Syringe in your light body material, place your triple tray, your full tray, take your impression, set the timer for 5 minutes and tell the assistant, okay, we're going to take another impression, but please wait to load the tray till I tell you. Now, the good news is during this 5 minutes, you're getting pressure, hemostasis, and the impression material is holding the sulcus open. So go ahead and let the full 5 minutes set, take out your impression. Don't even bother to look at it because it's not going to be any good. Rinse and dry the field. It should be good to go. Now take your second impression. Now, we also know that we can use chemically assisted displacement, and that chemical modified retraction cords offer greater sulcus displacement than the cord by itself, and most importantly, provides more hemostasis. And there are two types of pharmacologic agents. There are vasoconstrictors and astringent. And vasoconstrictors typically are epinephrine. And epinephrine works by, of course, ischemia as well as vasoconstriction, and it works very, very well and very, very fast, and that's why people like it. Astringents work by coagulating and precipitating proteins. Don't work quite as fast. But it's quite clear from the literature that epi in a bleeding sulcus in a cardiac susceptible patient can cause an increase in BP and some cases tachycardias. So if you have a patient like this, I would advise you not to use epi, because if you have a problem, it will be very hard to defend that problem. And it's quite clear that an astringent like aluminum chloride works every bit as well as epi. The problem is it doesn't work as fast. So remember, we just talked about that situation where you ended up taking 2 impressions. Well, that took 10 minutes. And even worse, cost you 2 times the impression material. If you have that margin that you had to chase down deep, and you're placing your primary cord, you're placing your secondary cord, you may even need to wet with some cotton and pack it into the sulcus with aluminum chloride. If that's the situation, set your timer to 10 minutes. Okay, you spent 10 minutes before, just set your timer for 10 minutes. Go do a prophy exam where you can say, well, hello, how are the kids? Have some coffee, but wait 10 minutes. Then remove all the packing with retraction material. You should have a clean, dry field and go ahead and take your impression. A lot of people like, as an astringent, ferric sulfate. Now, understand, ferric sulfate has a few problems. One, it can inhibit the polymerization of some polyethers. Number 2, it can turn into ferric sulfide, which is a black precipitate, an iron precipitate. And that's why you see the gums turning black. And it can stain the teeth, which looks really kind of tacky in the provisional phase and not very aesthetic. But the worst part of it is it can coagulate the plasma proteins in the dental tubules. And this can affect the bond strength of some self-etching adhesives. So while you may not have that black precipitate when you deliver your veneers, if you don't get a good bond, you're going to get marginal leakage very quickly and staining around the margins, and that is an aesthetic failure. Turns out phosphoric acid is a great way to clean the dental tubules. So if you're using total etch technique, you're probably okay. But these are just some things to consider when you use this product. Lastly, I want to talk about surgical displacement, and I don't want to talk about lasers or electrosurge because I just don't like, the lack of predictability in my hands. I want to talk about rotary gingival curettage as discussed by Ingram in the 1980s. And what the rotary gingival curettage diamonds had a specific shape. They had a 45-degree bevel at the tip. I'm showing you this picture of how I used to prep and how I used to teach preparation, crown and bridge preparation. And I just kind of shake my head at how aggressive this was and how I would never do this again today. But in the rotary gingival curettage technique, we would prepare a shoulder 360 degrees equigingivally to the top of the gingiva. We would then pack our primary cord. And if you look closely, it is 3/0 surgical silk. It's black. You can see how nicely it's visible through the sulcus. We now can visualize the dimension of the sulcus. And depending on the thickness of the attached gingiva, you would pick the appropriate width rotary curettage diamond. You would then prep 360 degrees around the tooth, staying above the primary cord, right? Dropping your bevel and removing or stripping the sulcular epithelium. You're actually creating a trough around the tissue. And this trough is what created the room for our impression materials. And the reason I bring this up is because it's one of the critical steps of the verteprep, which is very common in Europe and becoming very popular here as well. The need to open up the sulcus for room for impression material. I was fortunate to be one of the early evaluators of the technique for Rex, and I still utilize it today. And here's a case where I'm utilizing it. I have to replace some restorations that are failing. You can see the marginal leakage is evident. Sadly, we're going to need to do some flap and osseous around some of these teeth, but the good news is that they have to go to the periodontist to place an implant in the first molar. So I'm going to fabricate some indirect PMMA provisionals. Here's my impression using a terrible tear strength material, hydrocolloid, and you can see I've got nice marginal capture. But what I really want you to look at is here's the indirect model poured from that impression. And I want you to see the troughing, the room that was created by removing the tissue. And this allows for good capture of the margins. Here's my provisional before I finalized it. And to me, one of the more important pictures is here's the provisional ready to be cemented about 45 minutes after I took the impression. I want you to note, look at the tissue. For as much as I cut it, right? It turns out the smooth curetting of the tissue allows the capillaries to initiate their healing process almost immediately. The tissue looks pretty good for what we did to it in such a short period of time. Eventually, we'll get to cement a crown, hopefully. And a good friend, Dr. Stephen Hart, did a survey of dental technicians and both young and old dentists about why crowns come back high. It's very interesting how the data parsed out. Technicians blamed us. It was our fault. Right? The temporary was out of occlusion, the tooth extrusion. Young dentists were quick to blame techniques or materials, whereas older guys, we understood, again, there are multiple interactions at play, and there could be many things that ended up resulting in a crown that's too high. So what we do know is that the more we delegate our responsibilities, the greater likelihoods that we're going to have inadequate impressions or inadequate occlusal records. So you may have trained your assistant to hold an impression for you. And let's not talk to the triple tray material selection right now. You may have also trained your assistant to evaluate marginal capture. Okay? So let's just assume the marginal capture is acceptable on this impression. This impression was actually sent to a lab. And the problem is nobody looked at the other side of this impression. And this is the model poured from the other side. The impression was distorted. So, are we going to expect this restoration to be seated without a lot of adjustment? We're going to really have a problem here. How about this impression? Nice veneer preparations, right? I can see the margins. The problem is this was a two-step impression. This is how it poured up. Nobody double-checked whether the first impression was fully seated when the wash was taken. What's the laboratory technician supposed to do with this? Now you've got to bring the patient back. You've got to cut off your provisionals and take a new impression and make new provisionals. Not a good use of time. Physical properties of our materials are critical. Tear strength versus elastic recovery. When I was a dental student, we used hydrocolloids, so tear strength was critical to me. Stuff tore all the time. I hated it, right? And we know that tear strength is influenced by consistency. If we have thicker viscosity, it's not going to tear as easily. That's why, PVS, silicones are so wonderful. Turns out manner of removal is important too. And the faster you remove it, it's actually the faster you remove hydrocolloid, the less it would tear. But again, we talked about making our selections based on single determinants. So if you want tear strength to be your primary criteria in the selection of your impression material, guess what? You're going to have to pick polysulfide. Polysulfide has the best tear strength, but nobody wants to use it today because it does not have good elastic recovery. And elastic recovery is what's truly critical. The ability of a material to rebound back to its original shape when it's removed from the mouth. And understand, every impression that's placed and removed from the mouth has to get past an undercut. It's impossible not to have an undercut when we remove our impression. And this is where PVS shines. It has the best elastic recovery. But understand something, that it still can be distorted permanently. So we have to manage distortion during tray removal. If the stress is sufficient, right, it will deform. And this occurs when we take too long to take an impression tray out of the mouth. Let's say you've got a full arch impression of implant analogs and natural teeth. You kind of pull on one side, then you pull on the other side, you come to the anteriors and pull down, you go back and forth, you do this. It's hard to take out. Well, if you do that, you've permanently distorted the impression. It's really critical to understand that in order to get a temporary shape change, that you have to remove your impressions quickly. You can't dilly-dally with a full arch. You must take it out. You have to take them out quick. When you have a patient open, some patients open like really slow, distorted the impression. I say something like this to my patients: listen to me carefully. I'd like for you to quickly open now. So they have to open quick. Elastic recovery is not so good for impression trays. And going back to Rao, this is an impression I found at the lab. This is the opposing side, the preparation's on the other side, and Rao said number 2 problem was touch of impression tray. This impression is a failure. So why is that? Look at this tray touch. What happened? That means that this tray opened up, right? It got touched. It also torqued. And the problem with torquing these things is that they have great elastic recovery. I'm going to distort this triple tray and then release it. And it's going to go back to its original shape. And so it will distort the PVS impression. So triple trays, with plastic aren't a good idea. Viscosity, understanding physical properties of viscosity are critical in impressing with PVS. You need to understand that high viscosity materials don't flow very well versus low viscosity materials which flow much better. And low viscosity materials are light body or wash materials. Their job is, or their physical ability is to wet the tooth surface and copy and adapt to all the intimate details of the tooth preparation. The problem is it needs something heavier, a heavy body to hold it against the tooth, and most importantly, to create the hydraulic pressure to push it against the tooth. And these are our high viscosity or heavy body and tray materials. Again, they lack sufficient flow to intimately adapt to the preparations, but they will create that pressure to push the light body against the tooth. And usually there's a Goldilocks, material, and those are known as medium viscosities or monophase materials, and doctors like to use these for both wash and tray materials. So one of the problems, again, with tray materials, they don't have good flow. So you can get voids in your impression, and that's because they can't fill in the undercut behind the material flowing, and you get things like this. You get this big void in your impression. This is going to create a huge positive error in your die. One of the other problems is if you don't use enough light body material, the heavy body or putty will push it right off the margin. That's why sometimes you find all your light body in the buccal and lingual of your impression, and you've captured your margin in putty or heavy body. And this, as I'll talk about in a moment, is also a problem. But there's easy workaround. So make sure you use enough light body material around your preparation, and then also place light body on top of your heavy body material over the tooth prep and adjacent teeth. So now when this triple tray is bitten into, or use a regular tray and place it, the heavy body has plenty of light body material in front of it to adapt and fill into all the undercuts. Surface detail is the ability of the impression material to accurately reproduce the surface of an object, and it's directly related to the viscosity. Our low viscosity impression materials produce the best detail. So putty's accurate to 75 microns, heavy body 50, and our light body washes are 20 microns. Here's a situation where I prepared an MO gold onlay on upper first molar, and I had enough time to take 2 impressions. I took a hydrocolloid impression. I took a PVS impression. And, on both of them, I got a good margin capture. But I want you to look at my occlusal margin, the margin I'll be able to see and evaluate the most critically. Hydrocolloid tray material is every bit as accurate as its syringe material. The PVS heavy body, not so much. I went ahead and I poured both the impressions with the same vacuum mix dye stone. I waxed both myself, and I invested both wax patterns in the same casting ring, and I cast them both. And I picked the hydrocolloid because it fit the best. And this is the restoration immediately after cementation. You can tell it's immediately after cementation because you can still see flecks of Rely X powder liquid cement on top of it. And I like pumice satin finishes on my restorations. But what I want to point out is take a look at the occlusal fit, the occlusal margins, right, on the buccal and occlusal. This is a pretty good fitting restoration. And I think it's unfortunate that the phrase or the concept of quality dentistry has been replaced with the phrase clinically acceptable. I think we should all strive for quality dentistry and keep that in the back of our minds. So let's go back to that bonded Emax occlusal onlay I showed you earlier. I want to share with you the impression. Take a look at where the light body material is. It's on the buccal margin. So when we deliver this restoration and look at the fit and finish of it, it's pretty hard to detect where that margin exists. And that's because we utilize the most accurate part of the impression material. Now, I graduated in dental school in 1981, and I want to share a photograph with you. Okay? These restorations were placed when I was a dental student. Not only our requirements were so high, not only did we have to convince our family to come to us and let us do their dentistry, we had to do restorations on each other to get out of dental school. And so these two restorations were placed on a fellow dental student. And so I was able to follow this up with a photo last year. Now, if you take, said early that these restorations failed to go on axis loads. Take a look at the buccal facets, the MOD onlay. This thing's getting beat on. Look at the occlusal wear on that MO onlay. And further note, that MO onlay is on a wisdom tooth. Now, I used copalite and zinc oxyphosphate to cement these restorations, and they're still there. Why are they still there? It's because the concept of resistance is retention was so well taught to us. So at the end of the day, and it really doesn't matter if you're doing analog wax and cast, if you're doing digital milling, when qualifying resistance, you need to ask yourself the following, right? How much does the tooth structure have to break, or how much does the crown have to distort the luting agent in order to dislodge the restoration? Because ultimately, the geometric configuration of our preparations must try to put the luting agent under as much compression as possible in both closure and off-axis loads to provide the most resistance and ultimately the most retention. And with that, I'm done, and thank you for your kind attention. And I'm willing to sit around and answer any questions.
We do have a whole list of questions here, so I'll try and boil them down. If there's some common ones, we'll, merge them together. But let's just start hitting you with some questions here. Let's see. For multi-unit restorations and bite opening, do you still use Facebook?
Oh, okay. If the question is for multi-unit restorations and opening the vertical dimension of occlusion, that's actually two questions in two situations. So anytime you're going to change the vertical dimension of occlusion, then a properly mounted set of casts and CR utilizing a face bow to a class 3 articulator, an Archon articulator, is mandatory. Now, when you're talking about maintaining the vertical dimension of occlusion and doing multiple restorations in MIP, first and foremost, as long as you have teeth on either side, say you're going to prep second bi and the first molar, and you have a second molar and a first bi, a triple tray might be okay because you've got a posterior stop and you've got occlusion information from the second molar. If you're going to do multiple units in MIP, including the most terminal abutments, say you're going to do the first molar and second molar, then I would use a full arch impression and a face bow.
Okay. You mentioned triple tray. What are your thoughts on plastic triple trays?
Personally, I wouldn't use them. They distort way too easily. They're a bit flimsy. Early on, I'm going to admit to you, I used them, as I was trying to figure out what worked best in my hands. But I can tell you after trial and error that I settled onto sideless metal trays. And I think a preponderance of our colleagues who do a lot of crown and bridge are in agreement with me.
So why sideless?
Well, again, did you see the tray touch on the lecture that it can twist the impression tray? Also, again, if it doesn't bend out of the way, if it's, I have the only side metal trays you'll find are old hydrocolloid trays. And I can tell you as a hydrocolloid triple tray user, one of the biggest problems is the sides, it would torque a little bit and dig into the palate and the patients wouldn't close all the way. So if you have a stiff tray with a side, you could cause patients not to close completely in MIP, and then that defeats the whole purpose of a triple tray.
Okay. For our young dentists out there, could you explain what reversible hydrocolloid is?
Oh my goodness gracious. Agar. So it's seaweed, and you could actually, you would boil the material into a sol, into a solution, and temper it. You would then place it on the tooth and in the tray and cool it into a solid using water. So water would run through the impression tray. It was very popular and still is because it's cheap. It actually loves liquid. It's the only hydrophilic material. If you've done proper retraction and tissue management, you don't even have to control the heme most of the time. You can actually capture the impression in a wet, bloody field. But it's got problems. It has to be poured up immediately. So that requires that you have a vacuum mixer in your office and you've got somebody trained to do that for you.
All righty, thank you. Any insight on the retention of porcelain fused to metal versus full zirconia crowns?
Well, again, the retention is primarily the internal fit. And the fit of wax and cast is so far superior internally than milled restorations. Zirconia is really problematic when it comes to, remember, zirconia shrinks when you sinter it. So you're kind of guessing to a certain degree how much it's going to shrink. And then the milling process itself, the subtractive milling, is problematic. And if you really want to see how problematic it is, my suggestion to you is go visit your lab or have your lab send you, slices of the milling proposal so you can actually see for yourself how well it fits.
Okay, regarding margins, feather margins, I personally love the chamfer, but I've noticed some failed crowns with a thin feather margin. What do you think?
I guess the question is, what do you mean by failure? Secondary decay, leakage, or breakage of the restoration? Some of the problems with let's talk about the Vertiprep, which uses a feather margin and zirconia. The problem is with zirconia is when you fabricate it, if you try to mill it with a feather, it will chip, it will break. And so what the technicians have to do in the Vertiprep, where they have to create a cervical bulge for strength when it's sintered and then hand finish that bulge away. So you're not going to find that from a $99 lab. You will get that from a very good lab technician, but you're going to pay for it. If you're talking about marginal leakage, then one of the problems is if you have horizontal components to your preps and then a feather, as we talked about earlier, that the feather knife margin can be hung up and not seat completely.
Okay. And speaking of cervical bulge, in regards to your crowns, do you like a cervical bulge or how do you like your emergence on the buckle?
Flat. As flat as humanly possible. This goes back to Eudalis and Kawada and Stein. The flatter the emergence profile, the easier it is to keep the tissue clean, the restoration clean, and it just is a much better way to go. Again, one of the interesting things about the Vertiprep is that they combine both odontoplasty with the preparation, so you get incredibly flat emergence profiles. And I really think that's why the tissue looks so good with the technique.
Okay, could you clarify what you mean by odontoplasty there?
Odontoplasty is reshaping the tooth itself. So if you say you have a furca, if you blend out the furca to the osseous, then you can create a much flat, you're getting rid of all the bulges in the tooth. And this is in the, what plane is this am I talking about? In the horizontal plane. So it just cleans up all the nooks and crannies.
Okay. Lots of questions regarding cords. So what's the name of the cord you use again?
Okay, so in terms of specific, if you like to use hollow cords as your primary cord, I think Dan Fisher and Ultradent makes the best hollow cord out there. And in terms of, most people ask me, well, what is the 3/0 surgical silk? And that's just suture material. And, you know, it comes in different diameters, dimensions. There's three zeros or 4 zeros, which is 4/0. And you can buy it from medical supply houses on a 100-yard spool. A 100-yard spool will cost you $30. You can soak it in any chemical material you want, epi, aluminum chloride, and it's just a wonderful product, and it's stood the test of time.
Okay. What are your thoughts about laser troughing for retraction?
Well, it's going to create great room. Let's be real clear about that. As I said in the presentation, I just don't like it in my hands because I don't think it allows me, you know, delicate control. I just don't want to take away more tissue than I have to.
Okay. What are your thoughts then on porcelain trimming burrs for tissue like the Ceratip from Comet?
You know, it's basically the same thing as a rotary curettage diamond. You're doing the same thing. I'm not completely familiar with their burr sizes, so you know, you've got to be pretty selective. When you do this, when you use rotary gingival curettage or that burr, you want to make sure you're not removing anything more than the to height, right? The height of the attached gingiva, because you don't want to cause you don't want to move your gingival margin more apically than where it is, unless that's your aesthetic, outcome or desire.
Okay, we have about 4 more questions here. Is ferric sulfate more effective than aluminum chloride?
You know, I got to say, I think it is. Yeah, if I've got like, you know, the blood thinner patient, you know, that I have to chase that margin, I'm probably going to use ferric sulfite. Again, but these are the situations I find myself in clinically, you know, on posterior teeth. So yeah, the short answer is yes. And I will pick it in difficult situations over aluminum chloride.
Okay. Dr. Ochi, I was taught in dental school to soak retraction cord in hemodent and place it by double cord technique into the sulcus prior to final impression. You stated cons of ferric sulfate. Is there any cons to soaking retraction cord in hemodent? So I guess any cons to using aluminum chloride there?
No, not really. Aluminum chloride's an excellent material. So, you know, it just, again, if it just takes a little longer sometimes, and that's what you just have to remember. So if you have those situations where, you know, you may pick, you know, the ferric sulfide because it bleeds more, if you're going to use aluminum chloride, that's fine. Just give it the 10 minutes we talked about in the presentation.
You know, what I've noticed here is we have all of a sudden 34 questions. So it's 3:50 right now. Let's give it 10 more minutes of questions and then we'll knock it off. Is that okay?
That's fine by me. I got no place to go. It's raining outside and I'm in lockdown. So there you go.
Okay, well, we'll just keep rolling here. You already mentioned the burr for gingival curettage, didn't you?
We talked about the Comet version of it.
Okay.
Several manufacturers make rotary curettage diamonds. So I believe what Comet makes the BAT kit. That's the European kit for Vertiprep and rotary gingival curettage.
Okay. So you put light body in the impression tray before seating. So that's the question.
Yes. Again, the problem is flow, and because the tray material is such high viscosity, and again, think about seating an impression. You know, the angle of the teeth, there's always going to be an undercut. If you insert a triple tray, you have the bite into it. It has to flow over an undercut someplace. And so when you put the light body on the tray material, it allows that material, it gives it more running start, I guess the best way to say that, so that there's light body being pushed ahead of it to flow into all the undercuts, so you don't get those weird voids, on the axial walls.
Okay. Number of questions regarding retraction paste, such as Dries by Parkel. Do you use these products?
Well, like I said, retraction pastes are basically white clay, and they work very, very well when your margin isn't too deep. So incredible hemostasis, and works really well in those situations. So I use it in anterior cases, in the anterior region quite a bit. But again, most of my posterior, restorations are replacing old restorations that are already pretty far below the tissue. I'm not going to crown lengthen every one of these patients. And so I find that paste just doesn't work that well. And, being kind of pragmatic, and you can read cheap into that, why use it? It just doesn't make any sense.
All righty. During a crown preparation, do you prefer rough axial walls versus smooth walls?
That is a great question. I prep with a coarse diamond. You saw what it looked like, and I do not smooth my walls, beyond what I get from that. The only time, and I'm just being really honest with you, the only time I polish and smooth my axial walls is if I'm going to do a world-class presentation, and that is it.
Interesting. Okay. If your crown prep has a large core, are retentive features placed into the core contraindicated?
That's one of the best questions ever. So the short answer is I place retentive features into my cores. Now, if you really want to be crazy about all this, okay, if you could get your retentive features into tooth structure as well as the core, then you might die space out or ask them to space out more of the restoration in the core portion of that feature. But I typically don't do that. And so assuming you followed good isolation, good bonding protocol, I have no problem and I recommend it.
Okay. For a single crown on a terminal molar, is triple tray acceptable? If not, why?
Okay, what's going to happen in the terminal molar and where triple trays shine is capturing, assuming the patient bites correctly into MIP, that the occlusion, when you're, as a static term, when you're together, will probably be fine with a triple tray of the terminal molar. The problem is now you have no information, guidance information of cusp, facets in lateral movements. So the time and energy you save using a triple tray in centric is fine, but when it comes to adjusting the lateral interferences on that terminal restoration, I think you're going to spend more time than if you just took the full arch impression in the first place. In fact, I know you will.
Yeah, great answer. How do you feel about CEREC onlays and crown lays?
If I was as good as friends that do CEREC well, I would say I would love to be a CEREC user, but the learning curve to me is very, very high. CEREC, again, if you understand the limitations of it and you understand how to design your preparations, is a good manufacturing method. But it's not going to give you, the kind of control that fabricating indirectly or fabricating, with a better milling machine will give you. But again, if you understand where to, create your resistance and retention, everything is smooth. It all works within that 1 millimeter diameter milling burr. It works very well.
Okay. I had this question a number of times. Is there a PDF of this presentation somewheres?
Tim, let's talk about how to do that. I mean, you have a PDF of it. I just don't know how to upload it for people to look at.
Okay, we'll figure that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, after the fact. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ochi. That's very kind of you. what is the reason when you prepare a second upper molar for a crown and there is no wisdom tooth, sometime later you will see open contact on the mesial?
Okay, you know, this goes back to the triple trays work for terminal molars. And we talked about how the eccentric movements can be problematic. So what typically happens when you have an upper second molar drift distally opening the mesial contact is that you have what we affectionately refer to as a cross tooth interference. So as you move laterally to the working side, the eccentric contact will be on the lingual of that upper second molar, and the force is pushing it to the distal buccal, and you get an opening on the mesial contact. And so, you know, there are a lot of people talk about walking, you know, the crown back. So checking your centric contacts, making sure that the centric contacts are only on distal facing ridges so that it'll push the tooth or tip the tooth back. Well, that's fine in centric, but if you have that cross tooth lingual lateral interference, it's just going to keep pushing it, you know, back open. So that's why it's kind of essential to use full arch, because you have the contralateral cuspid in your full arch impression, which will help you prevent that kind of problem.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. This is a long question, but it said, if leaving VPS impression in too long and removing too slowly reduces the elastic recovery, how do you time the removal?
Well, the trick is to get it out just as fast as possible. Okay, and you know, again, I've watched people, like, you know, gingerly remove impressions in the clinic and in you know, pre-doctorate, and that's not what you want to do. You want to take it out as fast as you can. You know, and also, so let's think about this for a minute, right? If you're going to take it out and you also want to minimize distortions, how should you take out an upper impression? Okay? What are the angles of the upper teeth? They're at this angle. So you want to start removal. What do you want to remove from the contralateral side that your preps are on, or the same side? And my comment to you is, if I prepped over here, I want to pull off the impression tray by releasing it from the opposing side to minimize the distortion. The lowers would be exactly the opposite. If you want to remove a tray and your preparations are on the anterior, put your fingers on back bilaterally and pull down. So again, the direction of removal is along the long axis of the preparation. That'll minimize the distortion on your preparations, and that's what's critical. Understand something too. A lot of people love polyether because polyether is more hydrophilic, but it doesn't have as good elastic recovery. So if you have really tall preps or really long implant analogs, you know, you may want to rethink polyether, because it has a tendency to undergo, you know, permanent deformation when you have to take those things out. Okay, so PVS is a little bit better for those situations.
Okay. A statement here, personal experience and literature review is that scan mill is less accurate overall to wax cast pressed.
Could you say that again, Tim? I'm sorry.
That scan mill is less accurate than impression wax cast. And I think we're probably speaking the lithium disilicate here.
Yeah. So any, you know, wax cast is best, followed by pressed, followed by, you know, catting. Okay, that's internal fit. Again, I want to be really clear. Our marginal fits, right, are pretty darn good in all three techniques.
Okay. Again, we're getting questions. What tray do you like to use, and what impression material?
Triple trays or?
Yeah, triple tray.
Okay, triple trays, I use metal sideless. I think I use clinician's choice. So have been for a long time. My impression material choice, for partial veneer gold, I still use hydrocolloid. For full coverage veneers, I use Gosh, I don't even know the name of the company. I forgot, but it's a nice PVS product. I rarely use polyether.
Okay. I like this question.
Mm.
Why do you think so many zirconia crowns come back over contoured around the margins?
Well, for the same reason, we didn't prepare them properly. So again, they know that when they mill it, it's gonna chip, and that's a problem. So they just over contour it to compensate for the breakage later. And again, if you're not paying your lab enough money for somebody to hand finish that down, then you're going to get an over contoured restoration. So you have to ask yourself, am I reducing it enough to get a restoration that isn't over contoured? And if you are, then you have to go talk to your lab. And that's why these interactions between, we spoke to interactions between labs and us are so critical for success.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great answer to that, and that most people don't realize that your crown is designed and there's milling strategies, and that milling strategy can actually add bulk. And you hit the nail on the head, didn't you? That the lab technician has to finish that before it gets sintered or after.
Correct. Usually, you should finish it after it's sintered, because you may again weaken it before that happens.
Okay, where do you place retention grooves when prepping teeth?
Oh, that's a great question. So it's always 90 degrees to the shortest wall, so the weakest wall. Typically, on posterior preps, you'll get like a short lingual wall. So you would place it on your mesial or distal walls. If you say, here's a classic example of when you would put it on the buccal or lingual. Imagine a lower second molar that, you've got the tissue, you've got, you can't drop the margin, so you end up with a very short distal wall. You would want to put the groove, the resistance feature on the buccal or lingual.
Okay. Are you recommending?
And don't forget, in these situations, don't forget to use an internal feature, a pothole or an isthmus.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you recommending gold indirect restorations over zirconia if possible?
How about I answer it this way? If somebody wants to come to me to restore second molar, they get two choices: gold or go someplace else.
I like that. Question, how low to go towards cervical? I believe he said 2 millimeter ideal height, but what is ideal prep as far as distance from margin if aesthetics not issue? So,
well, if aesthetics aren't an issue, still, that's why we call it the occlusal onlay. It's still a two millimeter tall axial wall. It may only be halfway down the tooth or a third down the tooth, but as long as you've got the 2 millimeters.
okay.
There's no reason to go all the way to the tissue.
Why do you prefer a pumice satin appearance on your gold restorations?
That's just the way I've always done it. Patients, it's harder for them to see. They don't complain about the shininess. Used to love tin oxide finishes, and then they'd go home and they'd brush their teeth. They'd come back and recall, and it looked satiny anyway. So I said, I just cut to the chase and just start that way.
Do you want to get into any questions on cementation at all?
Depends on the question.
Okay. What cement do you choose for retentive preparations, i.e. gold or zirconia?
For both, I use Rely X powder liquid, and follow my protocol, of course, is properly designed preparation of zirconia. I like just to air abrade to remove the salivary phosphates. I don't use MDP based luting agents because I don't think they're necessary.
All righty.
God, they keep asking more questions.
Yeah, I know. Do you think a lot of labs are also milling their wax patterns? Does it lead to the same internal fit problems as milling zirconia?
I I can't, answer that. I just don't know. But again, this is why you need to have that relationship with your lab. You need to find out. Everyone needs to find out what their labs are doing. It's critical, in our decision trees and predicting success.
All right, here's a real important question. How's the fishing been?
Oh, it sucks. I have not been fishing. If that's from Brett, too funny.
I think it was a James Sampson.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Uh, you'll love this one. How do you
Mm.
manage temporizing short second molars or short crowns?
Well, okay. When it comes to, say, a bonded onlay, occlusal onlay, right, which is a very short operation, I just use straight Duralon. Excuse me, let me step back. I air braid the intaglio of my provisional and use Duralon with a drop of water in it, and I rarely have anyone knock off a provisional. The nice thing about Duralon and the bad thing about Duralon is it will, initially stick to the dentin because the polyacrylic acid. So even if they pop off the temporary, while they're waiting to have the restoration seated, they never have any sensitivity because any exposed dentin is covered with the Duralon cement. The problem is that the initial bond, because of the polyacrylic acid, is pretty good. So it, necessitates using a Cavitron to remove it so you can deliver the final restoration.
Terrific. Uh, when using low viscosity polyvinyl, do you use air to push it into the gingival sulcus?
A lot of people do. I do not. So if it works for you, go ahead, do it. I think the real secret is when you syringe it in, is to make sure you place it where in the sulcus when you start, and continuously, leave the tip in the sulcus, never lift it off the tooth as you express the material 360 degrees around. And then that's why adding some to the top on top of the heavy body tray material is also beneficial.
Okay, for restorative material, is its modulus of elasticity more important or its stiffness?
Well, I guess, in terms of, do you want a material at the end of the day in its location to act more like a tooth or not a tooth is going to be the question. So that's why we go back to second molars. What material do you want? Am I going to choose? I'm going to choose gold over zirconia because, I want something that's going to wear like natural teeth. I don't think zirconia wears opposing teeth that much, but if it doesn't have the ability to adapt to the changes in the bite, understand, even if we control a bite completely, in a full mouth reconstruction built to CR, guess what? That bite's different in a month because the condyle is constantly changing. So situation dependent. How's that for an answer?
We have somebody that says that if you have smooth walls on the preparation, you have a better impression. Comment?
I can't comment to that. I've neither paid much attention to it nor pursued any articles or literature to address that. So, if that person, has anything they want to share with me, I'd love to see it. I'm a literature junkie, as you know.
Okay. What core buildup material are you currently using? Are you using a dual cure or a chemical cure?
I'm using. Let's step back a little bit. I use fourth generation bonding total etch. So in my hands, I'm using Bisco all bond. And my core material currently is Denmat material. I like the white core material, the solid white core material for, metal ceramic and gold. And I use their enamel colored material for lithium disilicate.
Okay, this isn't an easy question to answer, but how and what technique do you use to prevent recession on anterior crowns?
Well, that's actually a great question. And first and foremost, whenever you do anterior aesthetic work, you have to have immaculate tissue. That they have to go through good hygiene before we even move forward. And then the assessment comes, what type of tissue you're dealing with, where is the osseous crest. So at the time of preparation, the tissue has to be very healthy. When they're numb, I'll actually sound right through the attachment to the bone to make sure I know where that is. And again, if the tissue is very thin, if I try to place my primary cord and I can see it through the tissue, I know that there's a good chance it's going to recede. And those are situations where I'll use white clay. If the tissue is really thick, again, I still want to be conscious of where that osseous crest is, because remember we talked about the physiologic dimensions of that sulcus only being 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter. If you have a high osseous crest, you go all the way to the bottom of that sulcus. You actually, if you don't have 3 millimeters, 3.5 millimeters at the facial to osseous and 4 at the interproximal, you can get a biologic width violation and some problems. And understand something, this is getting a little esoteric, but you can have a circumferential biologic width problem. If you place your margin in the anteriors, the osseous follows the CEJ. Sometimes, you're replacing a restoration that's already been there. And if you place your margin too deep in the proximal, the facial may suffer because of the circumferential fibers.
Okay. Anything to add?
No, that's it.
Okay. Dr. Ochi, do you prefer a chamfer prep or a rounded modified shoulder prep for zirconia restorations?
For zirconia, I prefer chamfers.
Okay.
The question numbers just keep going up and up.
I know. So we're gonna knock it off in 3 minutes here. I want to hit you with some good restorative questions. A lot of people saying thank you very much for the lecture today. And I will reiterate that. Thank you very much for donating your time and spending, hour and 45 minutes with us. That's just fantastic. Let's see. Are you concerned about gold wear and occlusal wear on second molars, especially in heavy grinding situations?
Well, Barkley said it the best. Our goal is to help, patients wear out their teeth at the slowest rate possible. So at least in a parafunctioning patient, gold wears with the patient, so it's not destroying the opposing dentition. So, like all things, nothing we do lasts forever. All we want to try to do is make it last as long as possible. And that's also a nod to why we want to use restorations that allow more conservative preparations, because tooth is priceless. Nothing lasts forever. If you place a restoration on a parafunctioning patient, they wear out their own dentition. They're going to wear out our restorations. So the more tooth we leave, the more options we have down the line.
Okay. Last 2 here. Lab Tech says smoother prep facilitates easier process for lab side in terms of milling since there are no sharp line angles.
Oh, absolutely. You remember, if you reflect back on that overmill proposal we saw with that beak. So burr marks aren't the issue. It's the junctions of the occlusal and the axial wall. So anytime there's a transition, those should be as smooth as or rounded over as possible, but not so rounded over that you sacrifice, resistance form. So
absolutely. Okay. In the case of recession, where should one keep the margin, on the root or the enamel? I guess, yeah, you know what they're asking, right?
Right. If you're using an all ceramic aesthetic restoration and you have enough axial wall height, I would always leave my final restoration enamel. We'll get the best bond. Just clearly, we'll get the best bond. the problem I think that happens is if you have that situation on a high lip smile case, then you don't have very many options unless you can match that ceramic pretty damn nicely. So I guess it's just situational.
All right, Dr. Ochi, I just want to say thank you again. Really appreciate it. This is one of my favorite lectures I've ever seen at the Operative Academy and the other academies. They're just, it so nicely is referenced in the literature, so nice and concise. So I appreciate you spending the time. I just want to remind everybody that the Washington Academy of General Dentistry, our Stay Home, Stay Healthy CE series is going to continue. All the CE is free. You do not need to be an AGD member to take advantage of that. We will be reporting CE credits to the AGD, but it could take up to 4 weeks for that to be credited. You will receive a CE certificate that you can print out within the next day or so. So everybody will receive one of those. Please, AGD members, hold on to that just in case there's an issue. Our next CE event is this Thursday. And I'm sorry, right off the top of my head, I can't remember. I know we've got Dr. Jason Kim in the afternoon, and I'm not sure if we have a morning presentation or not. But thanks again. We've got about 10 to 12 of these presentations coming up over the next 2 weeks, and we'll keep adding people and presenters in as they're willing to do this for us. So just want to stay home, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Thank you, Dr. Ochi.
Take care. Hey, Tim, one question.
Yes, sir.
Why does your hair look so good? None of us are able to go to the barber.
I've got to keep this slicked down right now. It's starting to become hockey hair pretty quickly. So we'll see in about 2 or 3 weeks of doing these webinars what it looks like then. So it's probably going to end up like this. All right.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to everyone today. I really, really enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks, Val. Take us out.
Thank you, Dr. Ochi. Thank you, everyone.